We're just about to start this session, so I'll give people like a minute to sit down or walk out, up to them. So thanks for coming this afternoon when there's a lot of negotiations going on, and we're into the, I guess, the meat of the week. I'm Kate Lappin. I'm from the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, and together with, did we do it with IBON? Yeah, or yeah, APO. With IBON International, we organised this side event. And we really are wanting to use this space to try and think through what the connections between climate justice and development justice, how the Paris Agreement and other international agreements can lend themselves to a more just and sustainable economy and political system, but with a particular focus on women's human rights. And we're doing this in the context of the social movements in the Asia Pacific region having come together and demanded a particular form of sustainable development, a particular framework a few years ago when we were negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, and we've called that development justice. We're going to start with a video just to give you a sense of what that means, because we really found that across constituencies, across 30 countries of Asia Pacific, from different social movements, when we collated the demands that groups had, that we could bring those together in a common political unity framework. And so in order to really more illustrate what the common concerns were, we tried to put together this video and then a framework that's been adopted by now more than 500 organisations. And this conversation today will be a little bit about what that could mean in practice. We have a political unity statement, but what it could mean in practice to deliver some kind of what we're calling feminist fossil fuel-free future. And for those people who participate in the conversation and give us an idea of what they think it would mean in practice, they are going to be given one of these beautiful scarves if they promise to wear it and say the tongue twister. And we're hoping that this will be part of a conversation over the next 12 months to document different groups' inputs into what would an alternative feminist fossil fuel-free future look like that could deliver development justice. So your inputs today are part of some of the first inputs into this process that we were hoping to launch next year. Although we now know that the next COP will not be in Asia. We thought it would be, so we were kind of framing plans around that it's going to instead be in Europe. But in any case, we'll find another avenue for our advocacy to launch the I guess, kind of framework of a feminist fossil fuel-free future. So let me start with the video, and then we're going to have some conversation. We're having more of a talk show style than delivering presentations, and then we're going to also engage you along the way in getting your inputs.
In the past 40 years, one economic model has dominated the global economy, a model that focuses on growth of production, growth of consumption, and growth of profits. To create this global growth economy, most governments agreed to create rules that benefit multinational corporations, privatize public resources and public goods, and push down real wages. This profit-focused global economy has caused two global crises: crisis of deepening inequalities between people, and a global environmental crisis. Together, these crises threaten the future of civilization and our planet. Inequalities between the rich and poor have grown in almost all countries. In fact, NASA-funded research found that inequalities are so high that they have become a threat to the very existence of civilization. But inequalities between countries have grown even larger. The bottom half of the world's 7 billion people collectively own the same as the richest 85 people in the world. Think about that. The richest 85 people own the same as 3.5 billion people. And 80% of the world's population still live on less than $10 per day. Another way of looking at this is through the Walton family. They own the world's largest retail store, Walmart, and have a collective net worth of $150 billion. Their wealth is derived from the work of poor people. Women garment workers in places like Bangladesh work for poverty wages, forgo health and safety standards, and risk their lives to make cheap disposable clothes for companies like Walmart. In an entire year, a woman garment worker from Bangladesh will make less than Christy Walton makes in 1 single second. There's a limit to an environment's ability to restore itself, and when we exceed these tipping points, we reach irreversible environmental changes that threaten our very existence. 3 of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been exceeded. If we continue to consume the way we have, the results will be disastrous. In Bangladesh, tides are rising 10 times faster than the global average, yet the country only produces 0.3% of the emissions driving climate change. By 2050, 50 million people from Bangladesh will have to flee the country. Where will they go? Will they go to the countries with the most historical responsibility for climate change? Or will they be forced to migrate across borders? They comprise 70% of the world's poor. They consume the least, are paid the least, and own the least, yet they pay the highest price. They are 14 times more likely to die in disasters. This is not an accident. This is a product of choosing to cut government spending, of privatizing public services and assets, and of providing tax havens for foreign industries. It's a product of growing multinational companies, unlimited extraction of natural resources, and overconsumption. In reality, we have a system of governance that secures profits for billionaires, but not a global system to secure human rights, economic justice, environmental justice, and accountability to peoples. Governments have created a system of binding rules to ensure the flow of wealth from developing countries to the richest countries. Rich countries try to compensate for the huge and growing gap by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. So why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year, poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries on loans that have been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. This costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest every year. Who is developing who here? People around the world are demanding a new, fairer approach to development. They are demanding development justice. They are demanding development that aims to reduce inequalities of wealth, power, and resources between countries, between rich and poor, and between men and women. A truly transformative development agenda requires a range of goals and targets. A new development agenda requires money. We can take these funds from global taxes on harmful practices and from those who exploit the world's resources, particularly transnational corporations. We can tax financial speculation globally. A financial transaction tax of 0.05% could raise $650 billion a year for governments to tackle poverty and address climate change. Less than 1% of the total value of extractive industries globally is enough to cover the annual cost of universal access to clean renewable energy. Just 5% of high net worth individuals' wealth is enough to cover the annual cost of universal social protection and universal social services. Just 1% of the global military budget would ensure universal public education. A more just and sustainable world is possible only if we demand it. Join us and demand development justice.
So that's a video that was put together, I think probably 3 years or so ago now. I think even some of the statistics are out of date, to provide some of the context around the advocacy for movements that were working on the concept of development justice. The panel now is going to think about what that would mean for particular communities, but also moving from particular communities to global frameworks. And we might start with Alma. She's going to discuss the kind of situation that she's been working on feminist participatory action research with communities, Indigenous communities in the Philippines that are particularly at risk of being displaced by large-scale projects, particularly in this case with Chevron. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists first to give us a bit of a sense about why in their communities there's a need to shift to not just the impacts of climate change, which we've heard a lot about how the impacts of climate change are particularly detrimental to women, but the broader impacts of extractive industries, of the kind of importance of shifting the model itself. So not just shifting, I think, the impact, the supporting adaptation, but how climate change is linked to a broader development model. And I think Alma's case can start us off with that kind of context.
Okay. Good afternoon. I am Alma Sinumlag. I am an indigenous person from the Cordillera, Philippines. I came from one of the tribes in the Cordillera, in the northern part of the Philippines. I would like to give a brief background of how of the situation of the extractive industries in the Cordillera. Together with my organization, I am working among indigenous women and their communities in the defense of land and resources and strengthening women's participation in our struggle for our right to self-determination. The Cordillera region in the Philippines, where I came from, is rich in natural resources, including mineral resources. Giant mining companies and energy corporations are currently operating there. Aside from that, our ancestral territories have overlapping applications for mining, energy, and other extractive industries. As a result, giant corporations amass profit and leave us to suffer the environment devastation. There had been lands sinking, massive siltation from upstream to downstream, causing massive bankruptcy among farmers from the indigenous, from our communities and towards the lowlands. There have been mine tailings leakage, and others, but corporations were not held accountable. In the face of all of this, indigenous communities, including women, were never silent. From our ancestors up to today's generation, rose valiant women, elders, youth who are actively fighting on the ground against greed-driven corporate projects. Today, as a case in point, our communities in Kalinga province in the Cordillera are faced with a giant energy project with which Chevron, a US-based corporation, is involved. This is a $300 million geothermal project that spans 26,000 hectares of our land. It is it is in the ancestral domains of 11 tribes. My organization, together with APWLD, worked among indigenous women for a feminist participatory action research and documented various human rights violations against our communities, against indigenous women and their communities. As indigenous peoples who have been defending our lands and resources for generations, we strongly believe that we have the right to plot our future, especially in the management of our lands and resources. It is part of our right to self-determination. To be able to realize this right, our unity as people is our strength, one of our greatest strengths. Going back to Chevron's geothermal energy project, they have used their resources in order to break our unity. They manipulated the process of free, prior, and informed consent process. They took advantage of our impoverished situation by bribing our elders, local authorities to be able to get the consent. But for many times, our communities disowned this so-called consent. Our communities have been conducting protests on the ground. They have been writing petitions and holding dialogues among concerned government agencies to raise their concern regarding the issues of the free, prior, and informed consent. Despite the overwhelming opposition, Chevron insisted on its drilling activities for temperature tests. The National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, that should be upholding our rights, continue to be silent about it. They are even facilitating scholarship grants of Chevron that continues to deteriorate our unity. The disunity in our communities is even threatening our harmonious relationship among the 11 tribes affected in the project. We have been living in harmonious relationship because of, in the basis of peace and unity. But our boundaries were never set or has never been defined has not defined finally. And the disunity among the indigenous tribes, our tribes, would mean that it can resurrect or can awaken the unresolved disputes among our tribes. And we are talking about 11 tribes here, and the situation is alarming. Indigenous women and their communities, despite this disunity, are firm that whether or not geothermal power is considered renewable, they will not allow this, as it is already breaking into our cultural integrity. It is an energy project that is based on corporate greed rather than energy needs of our people. We believe that the power to be generated from this facility will not service our needs, but the needs of the mining companies and other huge corporations in our region and in our country. We are saying this as per experience with the 3 mega dams project in the Cordillera, which is still operating until now. The host communities in these 3 mega dams were the last to be electrified or given the energy. What we want is an energy project where management, operation, and the whole governance of the energy facility lies in the hands of women, the youth, the elders, and the whole community.
Thanks, Alma. And perhaps before, we're going to come back later to touch on where does the community see their future. But just before that, maybe you could also mention about, we've had an action this week on the connections between militarism, women's rights and climate. And I know that in your experience, there's also been a militarization of the region. Perhaps you could just give us a little bit of a sense of that.
Our region has been militarized for endless. It has been endless. It has been experiencing endless militarization, and recently the community, one of the communities that is affected with the geothermal energy project of Chevron, is experiencing since last year militarization. The army soldiers, the army troopers, since October 2015, encamped in the houses of civilians in the community up until this day. And there have been human rights violations. One is political persecution of our community leaders, including women leaders who are actively opposing the project of Chevron.
Okay, and we might now move to Govind to give us a perspective from India, perhaps, which is, of course, enormous. So perhaps just a couple of examples.
Okay. So India is very paradoxical. At the moment, for the last 2 years, India is the highest growth in Asia, 7%, and highest violence and against women, against indigenous people. That is also, it is known in terms of all the indicators point to that. So there is an inequality in society and there is an equality within the home. And that really exposes that the growth economic model, that inequality, how it develops with us, and inequality has grown. So what we have been debating with a lot of women's organizations, a lot of civil society organizations, that what kind of lifestyle it should be that the inequality and exclusion are addressed. And they were thinking of that it has been really the 5 pillars of the non-democratic structure which promotes inequality that need to be addressed. And this is basically in simple words, it can be the junky lifestyle, endless consumption, endless production, and riding on one on another. So what are these 5 things? One is really addressing the structural roots of ecological unsustainability. That a lot of production goes on in the name of poverty, and this is the first time probably so far it has not been addressed, the question of that we need a sustainable order, a sustainable system. Second is inequality of caste and gender. We are known for the caste society. Caste, gender, and ethnicity. Ethnicity is the indigenous people. What you described, India is also have the same kind of indigenous system. Third thing that needs to be addressed is the centralized and hierarchical state order. That is, the state system also need to be addressed. We put in we are known as the democratic world or largest democracy of the world, but probably there is a very kind of centralized system of the state. And I call it, fourth one is the market fundamentalism, which is we call it globalization, but globalization within the system also, that market is going to address all the problems. So it is the market fundamentalism. And the patriarchy, which is prevalent in all its forces, but it is also really affects both formal and informal institutions. So patriarchal forces also has to be addressed in order to, when we talk of the transformation of society. I will take only one example in terms of what kind of energy is being discussed. That is the initiatives to centralized, environmentally damaging and unsustainable sources of energy we don't need. That has been discussed. So a lot of things is that, one is that all the grid power has to be there, but there has to be equitable access to it, and equitable use of that also has to be there. And the decentralized system also really call for the non-electric sources of energy. There are houses where people are promoting or asking for it. They call it passive energy sources. I don't know, for lack of any word, I will use the passive cooling, passive heating. There has this kind of thing. You don't need the heating and cooling system also for energy. So it can be reduced kind of thing in terms of, and there are microgrids that have been set up in a very kind of states like Bihar, which are known for backwardness. So it is not the growth economy, that is probably, which was very well pointed out earlier, and also that we are questioning that seriously, because growth has only created this kind of inequality. Thank you. I think I'll end up here.
Great, thanks, Govind. And that moves us then to a little bit about the global framework that we need to challenge in order to, before we get to the alternative frameworks, Tet can perhaps touch on what is the systematic connection between the growth of inequality of wealth and access to resources between countries, but between people, the rich and poor, and between men and women, and the climate crisis.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you all for coming here to our side event this afternoon. I think we need to ask the hard questions already, no? Why, despite 22 COPs, why are we still holding COPs every year? Because if the COP is supposed to represent the international community's response to this global crisis, then year in and year out, COP in and COP out only means to show, it only shows that we are failing, isn't it? Now, and already, COP 23, 24, and 25 is already being discussed in plenary. So it means we don't really have a lot going for us in this COP meetings in terms of really going to the roots of the problem. And that is where we need to ask those difficult questions. Now, why is it that the international community is failing to address continuing global warming, failing to address the root causes of the climate crisis? There's been a lot of technical discussions, believe me, no, in the past 21, 22 years, so many expert opinions. And I think the question now is, why aren't there political solutions coming out of those? Then we need to ask, what kind of development model is actually causing this climate crisis? One model of development that seemingly equates growth to development. And it is this very same model that has brought us to this multiple crisis. No? The video that we've seen earlier clearly points out to those interlinkages between the economics, the politics, and the environmental crisis. And it is also this very same model that, despite the hype, no, because 2015 has been lauded to be the year of years in terms of the international community's response to everything wrong in this world, basically. We have the SDGs, promising to leave no one behind. We have the Paris Climate Agreement, which again promises to save the world from catastrophe and further climate crisis. And we have the Financing for Development, the FFD, which again promises to provide us the means, no, to all those promised solutions. But then why is it now that despite all of these big international agreements, there is unprecedented poverty in the world? Why is it that despite all of the technological advancements, why is it that a lot of people are still mired in poverty? No, if you look at the statistics, although statistics are also political because they can grossly underrepresent the true picture, assuming statistics are reliable, 1/2 of the world's population, or more than 3 billion people in the world, live on less than $2.50 a day. And if you pull it out to those extremely poor, those living in extreme poverty, it's about 1.3 billion people who live on less than $1.25 a day. In this room, I'm sure, would agree with me that $1.25 a day is out of this world. No, it's out of this world. It's so not accurate, not accurately representing. So we need to ask those hard questions. Why is it that there's still ecological devastation and at a very alarming rate? Why is it that right now the main issue on the table is the increasing number of refugees, the increasing number of displaced people, leaving their homes, their families, their lands in search of a place that could take them? Now, we could even relate, all of this displacement that's happening right now, it's because of climate change. Controversial, no? It's climate change-induced droughts that lead to people migrating and leaving their homes in search of water, in search of food. It's climate-induced drought that drives food prices up. So we can say, in a sense, that the Arab Spring, the current Syrian crisis also takes its roots from climate change. So, despite the claims of rapid development based on conventional macroeconomic indicators, we find that this is unsustainable because it is one that is rooted on the rapid depletion of natural resources. It produces waste and pollution. It results in destructive cycles of depression and extreme inequalities. Now, why isn't mitigation, or why aren't deep emissions cuts happening right now? Simple. Because deep emission cuts lead to losses in production and lead to losses in profits. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tet. So for the second part of the questions, we're going to start to try and generate the conversation about the feminist fossil fuel-free future. And to do that, I'm going to ask my colleague, Camille, to give you all the conversation starter, which is a short discussion paper that's got 8 points as some ideas that have been generated initially around what would be the features of a new feminist fossil fuel-free future that doesn't just try and work potentially within the system, that doesn't just try and do what we've seen in some cases, which is just add women to the mix, but addresses some of the structural causes of inequalities. We would like to get some of your feedback around that. So, but as these are handed out, I'm going to ask the panel a little bit about how we can address climate change, the growth of inequalities, the global macroeconomic system, and change the kind of power relations that exist between men and women, between women and the state, between women and corporations, for example. We're not, and in doing that, we're suggesting that we do not just want to look at an equitable decline of the earth. We don't want just men and women to be equally impacted by climate change, nor do we want men and women to be equally living in poverty. We also aren't calling for women to be equally enjoying a share of global profits that are exploitative of other women. What we're really trying to suggest is that we could actually shift power to some, if we can shift power within communities, but shift the nature of power that is exploitative. So that's much more than gender mainstreaming, for example, which is, I've just come from the negotiations for the gender decision, and really see that this concept that women's empowerment is simply about having women in the room or having women have access to credit or markets as opposed to actual power. So really what I wanted to start, going back to Alma, is to ask what would it look like for the community to define, for women to be able to define the kind of future that they want, but living within the planetary boundaries.
Thank you. This is my first time to attend the COP, and I'm overwhelmed with a lot of languages, a lot of technical terms in this conference. But going back to my communities, I realized that we've been doing actions. We've been doing actions for a fossil-free future. For some of our communities, including one which we've conducted the Feminist Participatory Action Research, and it is affected with the Chevron's geothermal energy project. The community, including women, the youth, the elderly, are actually managing a micro hydro energy in the community. They are the ones who are running it. They are, with the help of the activist organizations in our region, with their indomitable spirit to find sustainable ways to sustainable energy. They access funds for these communities to be able to construct or to put up a small hydropower that electrifies the community. It powers the needs of the community, which is one of this is the rice mill, the corn mill, and other facilities in the community that the community needs. And women are active in operating this micro hydro project.
So in terms of the principles here, we have one where we talk about energy democracy. Do you think that particular project is an energy democracy, though? It's a democratically owned and governed?
Yes, because compared to the geothermal energy project of Chevron, which is really from the FPIC process, it's already fraudulent. It does not participate the women and even the whole community. This particular project, welcomes the participation of all sectors of the community, including the women. And right now, the microhydro project is operating for 20 years now, and the community is paying a minimal fee for the operation.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we have a fifth point there about the investment in the commons. And it just occurred to me because you mentioned that it powers, for example, a common mill or a common...
Yeah.
So I guess this is another element, that how to ensure that sort of common equipment, particularly in the interests of women. Yeah, okay. That's just learning myself here, even though I've read all of the material from Alma's community. And Govind, what do you think about, what are some of the examples that you've seen in your work where communities already have a concept of moving to more just, sustainable, but also gender equitable communities?
Very difficult to point out gender equitable communities. But we have a state, so it is not so, which is gender equitable, and the state is called, and the state is quite big in India, is big size. It is called Meghalaya state, which is the indigenous people's state. It's a matrilineal state, and in this state we found that there are lineage and the land rights are in the name of women, and lot of sustainable resources are there. Unfortunately, in the civilizational mission and market fundamentalism, civilizational mission, I call it influence of Christianity, influence of Hinduism, influence of Islam. Particularly, two religions have influenced them highly, Christianity and Hinduism. And now, so there have been some problems recently growing, but this state, I studied violence against women. I studied in this state about alternative economic systems and technological development. And you find that this is a much better state than any other state in India. So that would be one thing. So they said that we don't say no to technology. We want road, we want transport, we want drudgery reduction technologies, we want agriculture. This is their voices. But there has to be equality in this kind of development, and there is no pollution and no destruction of our resources. So commons are respected, but commons have been depleted. That problem has developed. In terms of the energy, of course, there are microgrids, there are there are consumer and producers cooperatives, or they call it collectives consumers. There are self-help groups where they don't have parda system, they don't have so much of violence. The recent violence has been noted because there was one case of abduction, and they were talking of, and which was fail, and they were talking that look at what has happened to our society. Somebody tried to abduct a woman on the road, and then I gave them the example of Delhi, which is known as the kind of internationally has been known for very high public and private violence against women. So the question is that if there is a equality within society and equality in within home, that is the real democracy that we are aiming. Because one of the things in the community resources, we try to find out that not community resources, in the commons, discussion on commons and community resources, we sometimes forget about the inequality that exists in our homes. And this is the inequality that state addresses very well, that we need democracy within homes and outside homes. Then only a equal and dignified society is possible.
So the first principle in the flyer you'll see is really around the just and equitable transition of the economy, including of the division of labour, knowing that most economies are built on the exploitation of unpaid as well as exploitative labour. So have you found any examples, as you mentioned, a focus on inequalities within the home, where a more just distribution of paid and unpaid labour can also be contributing to a more climate just, sustainable community? Is that possible? Yes, I'm asking you because you mentioned that the home. Yeah.
Yes, if it is not really no SNA, sometimes these SNA is a green growth and green economy. When we talk, I think we are tinkering around the same issues. We are not really addressing them. For the first time in SDG, we now are realizing that after so much struggle, that unpaid care, unpaid work needs to be recognized as work, and women need to be recognized as producers, which is the fundamental for human resources. So in this indigenous society, and I have been working on indigenous areas, not only in Meghalaya, but in other states also, both patrilineal and matrilineal states. So what has been really, only in Meghalaya, I find this kind of system is there, that work is recognized within home and outside home. So agriculture work is recognized as the work. I mean, production and reproduction comes with economic analysis. Work is really in terms of when you use either your mind or the muscle, and that is the work. And they say, of course, we are working at home, and that is recognized as work. So we need the new definitions. But there is a lot of resistance in the so-called the civilized world of India I'm talking of, which I am full with economists and full with they are addressing the problem now being done. And there are other examples, but let me, for the short of time, I don't want to talk about.
Okay.
But among the Dalit communities also, this is being recognized. that they are not bothered. So Dalit and indigenous people, they really give us a new path in terms of the analysis, how the work needs to be recognized, how the sustainability needs to be recognized. They have said no to plastic because the plastic bags have choked the agricultural fields. They could not irrigate, they could not do that. So in South India, in Chennai, they did that. So this is one example that is coming. And there are various examples that we need to put together.
Okay, I'm going to go to Tet for the last political question before asking for contributions. But of course, one of the challenges that we have when we call for a feminist fossil fuel-free future is that we know that the right to development clearly hasn't been delivered for the majority of the world. And within the agreement and the history of these negotiations, we recognise that there are common but differentiated responsibilities, and that that those countries with historical responsibility must take the deepest first cuts and support the global transition. But we also know that there are reasons, equitable reasons, to stop the use of fossil fuels. So I really want to come to you for how is it possible to actually move away from fossil fuels, and what would that mean from a perspective of equity?
Okay, since we're talking about the future, I think one of the saddest things that one could ever feel is, is that of not being able to imagine a future. No, I think I still come to COPs year in and year out because I can still imagine a future that is not within the confines of this current model that is being supported and strengthened with the COPs. So imagining a feminist fossil-free future would, of course, necessitate that we reclaim. Now we reclaim and take back what has been taken away from people, from women, from communities, from the South. It means we need to go back, no? Before the term sustainable development has been mainstreamed. I hate the word mainstreaming because it means losing the essence of things. Sustainable development was an activist term. Now it's so mainstream that it has lost its relevance among activist circles. But if we go back to the roots of what sustainable development really means, it's about emphasizing the interconnectedness and balance, now, between people and nature, among people and society, between economic production and social organization. Now, how are things organized in society? But in order to realize this, now, it requires system change, because these pillars of sustainable development are the very opposite of the current capitalist paradigm. System change cannot be achieved in the mode of piecemeal policy reforms. Now, that remains within the realm of the same paradigm. It must be in the context of imagining futures and building alternatives. So how do you now transition to a fossil-free future? It requires a transition, an ecological transition that recognizes now that there's an immediate need to cut emissions drastically. Those that are extremely destructive, carbon belching methods of production should be stopped soonest. No ifs and buts about that. But it also recognizes that different countries have different levels of development, different challenges of their own development and meeting the needs of their own people. So it doesn't have to be, we can use some scientific, science-based formulation about what is now the remaining carbon budget in the world, who have consumed and overconsumed this carbon budget, and how do we now reallocate what is left. Of course, for some countries in the South that have the low carbon footprints, but also very low capacity to transition right away into cleaner methods and technologies, it's understandable that they would need time and they would need support in order to transition. No, it's not really a very 100% tomorrow we shift to clean energy, to renewable energy. It takes time. It's a process. And in that process, there has to, Govind and Alma already alluded to it, it's not just a scientific or technological fix to the problem. It has to be democratic decision-making and planning. You also take into consideration issues around ownership and control of productive resources. We can talk renewables all we want, but if it is concentrated in the hands of, multinational corporations, renewables will not ultimately benefit the people and the planet. And we also talk about the need to shift to sustainable living. It's all also about mindsets, and how do we now transition from this notion of well-being or over consuming to a mindset of well-being. I think these are some of the important things that we need to consider in terms of how do we now make real our visions for a feminist, fossil fuel-free future. I'll get that right someday.
Right. Okay. I guess part of this global transition is also that the recognition that common but differentiated responsibilities means funding allocation must come from the developed countries, but it also means shifting the current macroeconomic structures that enrich, as we saw in the earlier video, that actually mean it's not just about the Green Climate Fund, but it's about stopping the leakage of resources and funds from the Global South that actually go to the Global North. In the briefer, we have a little bit about that. So we have a little bit about the fact that, in fact, to fund, for example, public investment, to fund the commons, and even fund the potential of things like a social wage that would allow for the time for people to have time for sustainable living. That would also allow for a redistribution of care work and of paid work. But this would require a change to the economic systems that privilege corporations, privilege a particular outsourcing to the Global South of labour with the extraction of profit to the North, and also allow for the extraction of resources. And we have there, for example, a global tax body that would have to end that kind of tax competition and collect funds, that would have to end tax havens. We also have issues around trade and the World Trade Organization. So there's a bit more in here, including this concept of a social wage, that we would be very interested in getting feedback. So I'm now going to hand it over. We're hoping that you're welcome to ask questions of the panel, but we're also quite keen to get both ideas, conceptual ideas, and examples of where communities may have already been trying to shift in ways that are both sustainable and equitable. So we're not just looking for technical solutions, and we're not just looking for examples where women may have used technology, but examples where both are shifting: the inequality, the global inequitable systems, and the gender inequality. So so the main questions we have on the back here are: what are the elements required to build a feminist fossil fuel free future, and where have you seen those shifts? But I'll hand it over to anybody who's brave enough, or anybody who's keen enough to wear a scarf to either comment on these questions, provide examples, or ask questions of the panelists we have. Yes. There's a mic, sorry. Yes.
But I would love to change the world, but it ain't going to happen. We're going to have to work within existing systems. And there are niches that we can work within to change the existing system. And one way that I'd like to, just one example, putting women in leadership decision-making positions. Because if you want to allocate funds, you have to get the body that controls those funds to allocate those funds for you. So one example is the OECD base erosion and profit shifting tax framework. base erosion and profit shifting is about making countries make transparent the way that companies are trying to erode their tax base and shift profits. And the only way you can tackle that is to first make that transparent, to see it. And so there's now the OECD has got that framework, and it's doing that, and that's sort of getting there. And so it's a tiny little step towards the miles we need to go towards setting up a global tax body, which would be great, but it is a step in the right direction. If there were women on the OECD decision-making panel, it might go a bit faster. And one way you can do that is to take the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Convention, I will call it, and that convention allows countries to take specific measures to that discriminate in favour of women to overcome historical disadvantage. And India is one country that has done that. And so I'd like to ask your views perhaps on the Indian, I believe there's a 30% requirement for women in very local government, the panchayat local government areas, and that's, there are some studies that have shown that that's actually changed decision making in that area. Another example is both India and Norway have now got quotas in place for women on the boards of all corporations, all listed corporations. In Norway, the quota requires all listed companies to have at least 40% women on their board. And in India, the requirement is one woman per company. So India's a little bit behind there because there are a lot of companies that had no women on the board, but now it's one woman per company board. And I'd like to ask your opinion on is that at the local government level, the quota requirement, has it actually changed things in your view?
Yeah, maybe I'll take any other questions or comments before we go to Govin. But yes, thank you.
But okay, I'll take a mic. So it's really interesting to hear a talk about a feminist fossil fuel-free future, because I think the word feminist carries a lot of different connotations depending on where you're coming from. It's especially interesting for me coming from Canada, unceded Coast Salish territories in Vancouver, to hear about perspectives from the global South and how your feminism informs the actions that you're taking and doing things like that. And also the system change that was just mentioned, which I think was a really incredible point. The future being, you can still see a future, and requiring that it be a system change. So I want to hold space for the fact that feminism it takes a lot of different forms. And one system change that I want to ask about or put on the docket, I guess, for discussion is the idea or the gender binary generally. So operating on the assumption of just men and women being the only two genders, and the only two genders worth taking up space. So disregarding two-spirit people and trans people and people who don't fit within a gender binary. I don't know what the context looks like in every country. I can only speak from my experience coming from Canada, which is a colonial state and deals with the imposed colonial gender binary and things like that. So maybe just where does that factor in? Does that factor into a feminist fossil fuel free future? Because it does. I think I got it. Because it does for me, and it does for a lot of conversations around gender, just generally. Talking about it as a social construct and how that construction is held up and how that's inherent and inherently violent and in so many places and in so many things that we're asking for change. It's yeah. I don't know. Was that enough of a question?
Yeah, that's a great
Cool.
question. And you get a scarf because you said feminist fossil fuel-free future twice at least. Yes. Can I go? Yes. Hello? Yes. Sorry.
Me? Okay. I just to add on to that point, looking at terms that are being used and how we use them. So feminism, that can mean many, like, yeah, just kind of reiterating, but it can mean many things. There are many types of feminisms, and understanding that within this kind of potential future, which I think is a beautiful, wonderful potential future that we're talking about. But we talk about feminism, we could be talking about ecofeminism, we could be talking about many different types of, and that can mean significantly different things in how we understand gender, how we understand women, how we understand people. And then looking at women specifically, understanding how we talk about them, because often I've noticed women are talked about in terms of their virtuosity, or how virtuous versus vulnerable, and there isn't really room for more than those kinds of identifications of women, and that can be potentially problematic in the way we talk about potential futures and making changes, because how we understand women and gender and all these other terms have significant effects on actual action that can be made.
Okay.
Hi. So I just wanted to bring a couple things into the room about the feminist fossil-free. Feminist fossil fuel-free future. It's been interesting for me. I don't usually create a bridge between activism and business, but I've ended up in the last year in a space doing that. And there are a lot of conversations that are incredibly similar that are taking place in the renewable energy and clean tech space, where there's a big shortage of women, and especially women of color, participating in solutions. And I think the irony is all of you all living those out on the ground, and with the participatory action research work that you do and everything, it's like, it's very alive. And then I think in some of the circles where it's being implemented, it's still very much a man's space. So I just wanted to share that. There's a number of women in technology and women in solar and women in renewables programs that are starting, and it sort of just feels like 30 years ago in feminism in Southern California anyway, where I've been doing this work. And so you know, there's solidarity there, and that within the sector, and there's also a really desperate need for people with a deep climate justice perspective who consider themselves as activists or even radical feminist activists to be interacting with women that are in those spaces, and to be bringing not just the actual solutions you're living out, but the methodologies you use. So the participatory pieces, the regenerative economy pieces, the way that y'all just naturally been doing stuff, they're kind of stuck. And the women in those spaces recognize that the patriarchy is alive in the what and the how, but they don't necessarily interact with you because they're in different spaces. So, and I'm always like the only activist that ever wants to go to these mixers and these meetings. So what I would just say is, as solutions come in and as monies get spent from different funds to support projects, you know, I just really want to encourage women to bridge out to other women in those other spaces. They may be in the private sector, but I mean, they're very much, their hearts very much, many of them in the same place as ours is, and they feel very isolated in those spaces as well. They're very jealous that we have our caucuses in our spaces, and they don't. So I just wanted to mention that it's a kind of an odd spot that I found myself over the last year.
Can I? Oh, is this working? Okay.
I think so. Hello, everybody.
Sorry. I didn't see.
Sorry. No. Well, I just thought I'm American, so today's weird and hard. But I think it was a really important point that we don't just want, you know, an equitable decline in the earth led by women, and we don't just want some women at the top to be sharing in the profits of exploiting other women. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering where people are at with this idea of this piecemeal change, which I feel like often these conferences represent, and if we can actually have that systemic change that takes away that effort of just having equity within a system that's inherently exploitative, and if change can come about in any way other than people taking to the streets and having sort of revolutionary actions, or how we negotiate that, because in my country, you know, our choice was not between, you know, it was between a man and a woman, but that wasn't enough. It was, imperialism was our only option. You know, we weren't presented with a full range of options that would have actually created a system in which women weren't exploiting other women, even if they were represented in higher levels of government. So I guess I'm kind of curious what folks in this room think about how that change comes about, and if it's possible to have it within our current processes.
Okay, and Carmen also had.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, a couple of years ago, under the discourse that, well, my name is Carmen, I am from Bolivia. And a couple of years ago, under the discourse of my government of the right to develop, I was always thinking that we have gas, we have oil, we should be able to use it. But this year, for me, well, all the last years, I've been learning so much and seeing the data and understanding that as a Bolivian, my carbon footprint per capita is almost as big as in Americans. It's been really shocking. And the oil explorations in my country have gone so far that right now are in the territory of voluntary isolated indigenous tribes. And for me, that's been scary. And for me, that is a threshold that we've been fighting not to cross, because we've been trying to protect all these natural areas that we have in the country. But in the last years, under the right to develop, we have seen that deforestation has grown, exploration of oil has grown, and so on. And I really think that it's time to a transition. A transition is urgently needed. That's why I'm happy to share the same vision with these wonderful women that do so much, like every day, in order to change this paradigm. For me, it is definitely a red sign that we have to stop oil drilling and that we have to shift to more natural, more environmentally friendly energies. And I would encourage everybody to keep fighting and promoting, because now it's the time to promote energies like solar energy and eolical energy, not only because it's good for the planet, but also because that way we can democratize our energies also, and we can make it accessible to all the people that need it. In the case of Bolivia, for example, you have poor communities that are connected. They cannot pay a monthly fee, so they don't use electricity anyway. So we have to really rethink what the energy that we want, that we need, how we use it, and so on. And I saw here a mosque which is run by solar panels. And I think all churches and mosques and any temple that is dedicated to any kind of deity of God should be run by solar panel. And I hope that's an example that it's repeated worldwide. And thank you.
But will it be feminist?
Oh, well, no, we also hope that this organization someday, we hope someday, will understand and will also be more feminists. We saw it this morning in our
That's
action.
right. We had
Yeah.
a faith leader, feminist faith leader this morning, didn't we?
Yeah.
That's right.
And there are many feminist faith leaders around there. We have to keep on pushing, and we have to unite forces, and we have to keep fighting for this common, what is it? Common future, feminist, free.
Feminist fossil fuel
free.
free future. We're going to make everybody say it soon. So practice.
Feminist, fossil fuel free with future.
I know it's actually, I guess it may be almost a little imperial itself, because if you're not a native English speaker, it's even harder than.
Yeah, since I came in here, I've really been trying to imagine how it will be a feminist fossil fuel free future. Really, I'm thinking in between looking at 1.5 degrees and 2.5 degrees temperature limit. And for feminists, what kind of numbers are we looking at? And then this 1.5 degrees and 2.0 degrees, where did it come from? Did it come from the market? Did it come from sciences? Or how do feminists also, how are we conceptualizing this temperature thing, because it's so important for us as feminists also to add our voice to it. I know within me, looking at some of these things, 1.5 degrees, 0 degrees, limiting the temperature, are we really going to get there? For me, it's about markets. Also, although it's about sciences, but it's like sciences is not really taken into consideration when it comes to profits. And then if you don't take that to profit, if you don't take that to account in looking for solutions, and then we are thinking of an alternative, a feminist, a kind of transition that will enable us also to look at things in a different way, within a different space, then how do we as feminists are adding our voice and also rethinking and also adding our voice to those temperature degrees that have been laid down before us? Yes, some of this come from patriarchal system. What do we as feminists also have to say to it? And the second issue I want us to also look at in terms of envisioning a feminist future around this area is the issue of gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming at times could help to reproduce what we don't want, sexual division of labor that we don't want. Then we have feminists on the one side. So how do we also help gender mainstreaming to transition to the kind of future that we want? Do we really want to still stand with gender mainstreaming, or do we really want to look at how men and women relate actually and see how we move away from those kind of regimented understanding of how women does things and men does things? How do we really want to ensure that we actually have this kind of a gender democracy or gender harmony that we as feminists are envisioning? Those are the kind of questions I want to ask.
Okay, thank you. So, there's two more. So here and then.
Thank you. My name is Susie, and I attended a meeting a little bit earlier that just blew my mind, and I have to say something here because it showed the windmills going up in a country, and it was that.
Sorry, is the mic on? I can't hear you that well.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay, that's good.
Sorry. It showed windmills going up, and it was just beautiful all over the landscape. And then it showed the road that the people came in, and the truck driver was talking. I think it was a company from Norway was coming in and putting up all these wonderful towers. This is the solution to get rid of the fossil fuels. And then it showed that they just came in on the land of the indigenous peoples. Did you see it too? Oh my gosh, unbelievable. I just couldn't believe it. They didn't buy that land. I don't know how they got there without any thought to the indigenous peoples. And it was a very, very windy area. And I think we need to just think about that too, that we want to get rid of the fossil fuels, but when we go in, we want to do it right. So thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to respond to this idea about women. If you put women at the top, they will just enjoy the benefits of exploiting other women. If a woman is at the top and she's exploiting other women, she's not a feminist and she doesn't want a fossil fuel-free future. If women were on the board of Chevron, they would be saying to the board of Chevron, we need to move out of fossil fuels and we need to stop exploiting women. That would change the behaviour of that company. And that's why we need women in decision-making positions. So they can be feminists and they can want a fossil fuel-free future.
Okay, one more here. That's great. I'm glad we've got so many comments.
I'm from Brazil, and there we have like a major issue involving. Can you hear?
Yeah, just a bit
now.
Closer.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I'm from Brazil, and there we have a major issue involving women. It's one of the most dangerous countries for women, and there is a historical background of violence towards women. And in the past year, women have increased their fight, and feminism has been growing up, especially with young people such as me and my friend. And we also have an issue towards environment. We are one of the countries with biggest resources, but we don't have sustainable development. But I've never heard until today, not today, but until I see the COP programmation about a convey of feminism and the fight for sustainable development. And I think it's like a silly question because for you it may be very intuitive, but I'm kind of confused on how those two things convey, like how you can make a, sorry for my English, how you can fight for gender and for environment together. That's it. Thank you.
Great. So what I'm going to see if the panel would like to respond. There were some specific questions like on the Indian Panchayat and also on gender binaries and gender identities, and then about, you know, what is this bigger vision, this struggle, as well as the role of women in whether women alone, putting women into the system will change the system. And I think there are a whole lot of other comments as well that maybe have been fantastic to generate and see that there's a lot of movements asking the same kind of questions and thinking similarly about system change. I think our starting point is that we have to change. We will have to change. We will, because we're either going on the road to a climate catastrophe, or we are going to change something pretty quickly. So will that change, whether it be a dystopian catastrophic change or the change driven by people, be a feminist one? I mean, that's really what we're trying to find out. Is it possible to shape that change in ways that are deeply feminist, or in the ways, the different concepts that feminism mean to different social movements? But let's take a few responses. I mean, we don't have answers necessarily, and we're engaging in this conversation to see what else we can imagine. But we'll see if the three panelists have some responses first. So, who would like to start?
All right. First of all, I wanted to share that feminism also has been changing. I mean, both in the US and also in the South. I mean, in India, particularly, I can talk of, where the Muslim and minorities women said that, are you more sacred than us, kind of holier than thou question raised. And black women in the South, in the US has said that, are we sisters? So feminism also has learned, and that is also one of the things. It is not a static kind of thing. We also address the question of our own location and our own identity, and how we want to be inclusive. That is the one thing. In India now, not only 30% representation, but 50% in some states have gone. And those women are doing fantastic kind of work. So I don't really buy the analysis. Some people dismiss it, saying that, oh, it is only the proxy kind of thing. They are not proxy. There is a tremendous struggle that women are waging that. But it has to be a constitutional change. Look at this kind of thing. Constitution has to be changed. So that is the thing. Then when women were to be included, they are 50% in the population. They should have been represented 50% in decision making. But the change has stopped there. Change has not taken place in the parliament. And women from all political parties have struggled and for their representation in parliament and local assemblies. It has not yet happened. So you can see that how the patriarchal forces come. Second question I'm a strong believer in change. Change has been happening, but we need to really look at what change has taken place and what are the sticky areas, why certain change is not happening. And that's why the patriarchal forces are very, very important. Patriarchy need to understand. That is what somebody said, America. You said, I'm an American. We do not really see the difference between, I am talking my perspective, between North and South that way, between America and India. My daughter is an American. Okay, how do I see that? My sister is Canadian, the kind of thing. And how do I see the difference? That is the personal level. But second level is, we are talking of systems. We are talking of against the growth. There is a North there is South there is north within the south and south within the north kind of thing. So treatment of the blacks, and blacks I include Indians also. That is the in America is very, very evident. I hope it doesn't get worse. And treatment of Dalits and treatment of indigenous people in India is no better at the same level. So we are really talking of that with economic growth, why this change is not happening. That is what that point we wanted to make kind of thing. It's not, when we talk of there is some power within feminists also that we need to do, and there is a kind of struggle. But by and large, I think feminism so far is the best movement according to me. Second is the environment, that is the word. And these two changes have made the difference. Do I have the third point to say that?
Okay. We've only got a couple more minutes. I better move. Yeah,
okay.
Just quickly mention.
How do we capture the future? And how do we we really need to discuss the changes that are happening at the local situation in indigenous communities, in India, and everywhere. We need to put together that how people are addressing the sustainability, in real sense, not the sustainability in terms of the capture. That would be as researchers, as practitioners, as activists, we need to do this. And the change is happening. I mean, there is a lot of change. In India, for example, I would say there is a lot of effort now to learn from Africa. South-South change that is happening. That was not the situation when I was young, kind of thing. So that there is a lot of learning that is happening. I am working a lot on energy, and I see that how well the change is happening in South Africa, for example. Change has happened, although now there is a little bit derailment. So there is this kind of changes happening, but also it is stopping, and we are bothered about why it is stopping. I will stop here.
Alma, have you got any final reflections? Actually, Alma, I might also ask you, because there was a discussion on how we use feminisms, and that when we start the feminist participatory action research, it's with young feminist researchers who are with the community, and some of those communities have probably never used the word feminist at all, right? And then we talk about feminisms, as was mentioned, and the types of feminisms and how we craft our own. And it might be interesting to hear from you about how you work with a kind of feminism that perhaps Indigenous women can foster or grow or name themselves.
Yeah. For our organization, the term feminism is not really, what do you call this? The local communities or the indigenous women cannot grasp the term feminism. So what we, in our understanding, feminism arose from inequalities, right? So in the communities where we conducted the feminist participatory action research, we let them speak their minds. As you have said earlier, feminism today comes in many forms. So feminism from the communities means that giving voices to the voiceless or the powerless. For example, in the Philippines, the indigenous communities have been marginalized for quite a long time, and they need their voices to be heard. And within the communities that we work with, there is the voices of the women are what do you call this? It's not really as powerful as the voices of the elderly, as the voices of the men. So what we do is that we give space, we give them space to talk about the issues, the pressing issues in the communities, and how they would want to plot their future. For example, in the case that I presented, the micro hydro power thing is not actually run and operated solely by women, but it is we consider it as a feminist thing because women are fully participated in the process from the planning to the construction until the operation. The voices of the women are heard. That's why the rice mill, the micro hydro powered rice mill, because when you grew up in a community where there's no power, you have to manually pound the rice before cooking it. So for the women, it's liberating for them to have the rice mill powered by a micro hydro, which they were part of the construction.
Okay, I might, before I go to Tet, I think, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, just to maybe for us to touch on a little bit on how the work we're doing is, I mean, it's really an interesting question that was asked about, are we always thinking in gender binaries, and is a feminist fossil fuel-free future liberating from that concept? And I mean, I think that's a contribution that we would invite other social movements to provide. We do want this to be an inclusive discussion and can want other social movements to be thinking about how this vision could challenge other oppressive structures. But I also think that what we're trying to suggest is that the market economy itself, which is driving climate change, is based on gender divisions that ascribe a particular role, which is, a particular role thinking that women should be caregivers and so forth, and exploiting that as unpaid labour, and that the market therefore is dependent on that binary. The market itself is grown on the idea of growth, but also on the idea that labour can be easily exploited because it has this dependency at home and so forth. So it is part of trying to shift that economic model in ways that I guess question those underlying gender roles and could also question those gender binaries, hopefully. But that's something we would really like to see other contributions. The other comment I think importantly, and it's great to have young feminists from other continents to share with, is this is really integrated, that the exploitation of earth and land is particularly exploitative is dependent on the exploitation of women, but particular groups of women. And that's why I think in the work we've done, it's appealed much more to Indigenous women, women in rural communities, in women who are otherwise, even, for example, we mentioned Bangladesh. So garment workers, even in Bangladesh, are interested in this because it's so connected between the systems that make women come from the rural area to look for work in the city, then may have to migrate to become a domestic worker. So I think it's one of the issues around why it's important for feminist movements. It's because we're working with those type of feminist movements. And the other point I think is that it is a feminism of solidarity. Justice, the original concept, is one of solidarity. It is between social movements as well, so that we expect other social movements in the development justice framework to look at gender, what we call gender justice in that framework, and not just ever lobby for only environmental justice. And similarly, we always argue for economic, environmental and redistributive justice as a feminist movement. And that's how it's a movement of solidarity, and that we're not trying to argue for separate demands. And then I wanted to just leave the last question. Perhaps we have to go when we're going to give these, but the last question, which was, is it possible to Tet is...
Maybe it would be good to have a chant around the room. The women united.
We'll never be defeated.
Come on, we're not going to defeat anything with such low energy. The women united.
We'll never be defeated.
I think this is all a process of building democracy and asserting our sovereignty. Now, imagining that future involves building democracies and asserting people's sovereignty through different modes and channels of action. So I was going to respond directly to our young friend from the US who may be feeling so down and out now. But since she left, I hope my... all right. No, I think one thing that we need to realize, these spaces are so disempowering. The very few of us who are able to come here, have the resources, have the energy to follow these processes, we will find it so frustrating and we feel drained after 2 weeks. It's only been 3 days and I already feel so tired because it is inherently disempowering. The language, so technical. If you're not an expert in following one track, you'll get lost, especially if it's your first time in these spaces. You'll be a tourist, milling around the stalls. Nice souvenir. Getting lots of business cards. But what does it actually mean for you? Not for you to be able to engage meaningfully. It's also disempowering because the setting, the badges, you're an observer. It's already predetermined. You observe. They party. So how can it be a space where you can have collective solutions when some are just observing and others are partying? Yeah? If you get lucky, you get 2 minutes intervention, and those who party do not listen at all to those interventions. So what do we need to do? Why are we still here in these spaces? Because we need to raise the bar. We know that the UN spaces will not solve the problem, will not change the world, but we need to be here asserting our rightful space because it is no longer just governments. And actually, part of the problem, governments who have been talking about finding solutions to these problems. Now, we need to claim and assert our right to these spaces by raising the bar. Of course, our solutions, even if it's so hard to be technical and political, but we need to merge those two. We need to be technically proficient in order to be able to advance our political causes. In language, okay, we can provide language that is raising the bar so high that for sure it would amount to system change. We need to raise a lot of noises around these spaces because it's so difficult to be heard. We can be seen, but we are definitely not heard. That's why our action this afternoon, no? Do we need to wear mustaches in order to be heard? I don't think it has to be that way, but we need to demonstrate that to drive home our point that it is not just the men, it is not just those who wear mustaches that has a right to be heard. All right? So, we need to safeguard what is already there. Now, a lot of the language is being massacred in negotiations, and the very nature of negotiations is always a compromise. So we need to defend and safeguard what is already there, raise the bar, and also to advance our interests and our aspirations. So let's go make more noise. The women united
will never be defeated.
Advance our cause for a feminist, fossil-free. Oh my gosh! See, I should get it right. Feminist, fossil fuel-free future. All right.
And with that, I don't know if you've ever heard the expression that the revolution is only a t-shirt away. Now we're making it, the revolution is only a scarf away. So you're able to have a feminist fossil fuel-free future scarf because you've given such wonderful contributions and really generated a discussion that we were hoping to have. I'm really very grateful that there were so many ideas shared and challenging us, but I also ask you to give some consideration. On the back here we have a number of ways that you can continue contributing. You can contribute by sending us an email. We also have a WhatsApp way you can send a short video message or WhatsApp us. Or over the next few days, my colleague Camille and I and all of us will be here, and we would really like to get more contributions that we can continue the discussion and try and grow a global conversation. So thank you very much.
All right.
Yes.
Yes. Here.
We're out there.
Feminist fossil fuel free future.